Well, can I first say thank you so much for this, for organising all this, and I don't remember all your names, but you've done a fabulous job. It's wonderful, and also for my good friend Yotam, who came over to England and did some training in compassion focused therapy, and is now sort of leading the way here in the Bay Area in California. I'd love to think you've all come to see me, but unfortunately probably not, because you don't know me. But what you've come for, I think, is because of your interest in compassion. So that's the reason that we're here, because all of us intuit at some level of our being that compassion is what the world needs today. So let me just tell you a little bit about the workshop. The workshop is going to be organised in two basic parts. The first part is quite intense, quite quick, taking you through the basic premises of compassion focused therapy. And then this afternoon, so don't eat too many bagels, we're going to be doing exercises. Now, if you eat too many bagels, you'll have too much carbohydrate and you'll all go to sleep. But so the exercises will come this afternoon, and they will be primarily guided imagery exercises. Okay, so just to remind you about the typical things of a workshop, during the workshop, we're going to be engaging in various exercises, particularly this afternoon. They're all voluntary, of course, and you're responsible for your own well-being. So some of the exercises might tap into difficult things for you. If they do, just pull out of them and go at your own pace. All information shared is confidential, of course, because this is a clinical training, and you're responsible for how you use CFT. So if something goes wrong and you end up in court, you can't say, "Oh, it's not my fault, it was him, he told me to do this." Okay, now a little story that I always like to tell about compassion is that compassion is potentially very powerful and will change you, and that can have consequences. And the story goes like this. There was a lady who was a little overweight, and so one day she was rushing at work and slipped on the stairs, fell down the stairs and had a concussion. And while she had a concussion, she had a vision that she went to heaven and saw God. And while she was in heaven and saw God, she said to God, "So that's it then, I'm a goner." And he said, No, you just got a concussion. If you look after yourself, you've got 40 years, but you must look after yourself. Take care of yourself, be compassionate to yourself, nurture yourself, okay? So she said, yeah, I got it. So she came round for she came round from the concussion and said, right. So she went on a diet and she went training, one of these people you see with the earphones, training and running. And went for the last little bit, went and had some plastic surgery. Came out of the hospital and I'm afraid got knocked over by a truck. So she ends up in heaven and says, "God, you told me I had 40 years. And he said, "I'm terribly sorry, I just didn't recognize you." Now, the thing is, compassion changes you. And of course, that's the point of compassion. Compassion is a change agent. Okay, we need to understand the processes by which compassion is a change agent. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of how we started with compassion-focused therapy. And I'm also going to explain how we root this in evolutionary and neuroscience. Now, basically, compassion-focused therapy is what we call a psychological model. Okay, so although we use a lot of CBT, it's not a CBT model. Although we use a lot of behavioral concepts, it's not. I mean, if of all the models, it would be behavioral actually. We use some psychodynamic ideas, but it's not a psychodynamic model. We use humanistic ideas, but it's not a humanistic model. It's a psychological model, which means that the data and the evidence that comes from our psychological science is at the core of this. Okay. It's also called compassion-focused therapy, not compassion therapy, because it's about the way you do any kind of intervention, be it an exposure or generating alternative thoughts or social skills training, has to be conducted so that the patient experiences this in an affiliative, supportive, and encouraging way. And helping people experience an intervention is part of the job of the clinician, because we can do interventions, but patients don't necessarily experience them in a way that's helpful. So this is how we all began. Firstly, there's been a long term of clinical observations that people can struggle with standard therapies. There are certain types of depression that don't do well in any trial, and these tend to be your self-critics and high shame-prone patients. And so I got very interested in this group of patients who weren't doing very well. I was taking patients who weren't doing very well with other therapies, many of whom had had years of other therapies, to see what we could do with them. And I was also interested in understanding evolutionary mechanisms by which various kinds of emotional problems were maintained. So if you remember your CBT, and you know what CBT stands for, don't you? Can't believe this, right? CBT is tended to focus on helping people recognize that their thoughts can kind of take them over, as it were, and then they get caught up in various loops. And we're going to be talking a lot about loops. And therefore, you have thoughts that are helpful to you, thoughts that are unhelpful to you. And it's very important to remember that that part of the trick of the therapy is finding what is helpful to your patient. Okay, now sometimes evidence is, but sometimes it isn't. And Tim Beck was always very clear about this, that it's not just about evidence. So, for example, if you're on the top of this roof and the building's caught fire, and you have to climb down the drain pipe, and you have the thought to yourself, if I slip, I will kill myself. I'm afraid that's true, but it's not a good thought to be focusing on when you have to get down the drain pipe, because if you focus on that, you probably just get paralyzed and you can't move at all. So the key is then helping people generate alternatives which are experienced to be helpful to them. And this is where the interest starts to rise, because you have a lot of people who say, yes, I can see the logic of the therapy, I can see the logic of what we're doing, but I just don't feel reassured by these alternative thoughts. Or I know I'm not to blame for the sexual abuse I received as a child, but I just feel to blame. I just feel that it's something about me, even though logically I know it isn't. And so this mismatch between cognition and emotion became very interesting, very important. And the key issue is then that we need to feel congruent emotion in order for our thoughts to be meaningful to us, because it's emotions that tag meaning. Right? And Savannah Tompkins pointed this out many, many years ago. Without emotions, nothing has any meaning. So imagine that you have no emotions for your children. So it doesn't really matter if they live or die. It's just one of those things. You don't have any emotions about if you live or die. So feelings are the key, and feelings are the thing, of course, that's been central to evolution. So in order to be reassured by a thought, say, I'm lovable, especially if a depressed patient says, no, I'm unlovable, so we're going to try and help them feel lovable. This thought needs to link with the experience of being lovable, you see? If I was to say to you, I want you to understand my love of jazz, if you've never heard jazz, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about. If you've never felt lovable, if nobody's ever bounced you on their knee and saying, I love you, you are wonderful, you are my son, you are my daughter, I love you. Then, of course, how are you ever going to feel something you've never experienced, right? So the point is, a lot of the patients that we were working with came from very difficult, traumatic, stressful backgrounds who had never really experienced lovability, or never experienced being of value to anybody, or that they mattered to anybody. So trying to change thinking wasn't going to work for these folk. So compassion-focused therapy that really targets the system that gives rise to these kinds of emotions, the emotions of affiliation, the emotions of being, of value, of lovable, and so on. And that's what we're going to focus on. So that's the first bit then. So why do we need compassion? Well, we need compassion because life is very hard. It gets to the it's very difficult. So, and many philosophies and religions have addressed the issue of why life is hard. It's interesting that in the Christian traditions, for example, monotheistic traditions, they all believe that this life is not the life of happiness. The next one is the life of happiness. And you have to do certain things in order to earn your ticket, right? There's a wonderful book called The Pursuit of Happiness by Mcmullen, a guy called Mcmullen. And he points out that a lot of the early Christians were falling over themselves to get eaten by lions because they were off upstairs, you see. So this was the thing. It's only been very recently that people have started to think, actually, we can make this life a life of happiness. And that's a Western dream. If you just have another television or you have another hamburger, you will be happy. In the Buddhist traditions, the reason for suffering is related to the Four Noble Truths, as you will be aware, particularly here who have the compassion cultivation training, that there is suffering, which is really dukkha, and dukkha actually means dissatisfaction, really. And this arises because of the impermanence of all things, that we aspire, we crave for things to stay the same, we crave things to be nice, and we try and avoid things that are unpleasant, but that's often difficult. There is the cause of suffering, there is a sensation of suffering, and there is the path to the sensation of suffering. Now, I'm not a Buddhist, so I'm not going to take you down that road very much, although we will be using some Buddhist concepts, so we need to be respectful of the lineage. But just to point out that the nature of suffering in the world has been a fundamental philosophical question for many, many minds for many thousands of years. What about an evolutionary approach? Well, from an evolutionary approach, it arises from biological forms itself, from life itself. The fact that you are embodied, you have a body that will grow, decay, and die, that is vulnerable to injury, that is vulnerable to disease, is what makes pain and suffering come into the world. And although Buddhism has this idea that we are not separate, in fact, biologically we are, and we have to be, because separation begins with the evolution of the membrane. Without the membrane, there is no evolution. Evolution progresses throughout. Evolution can't progress without separation, and it's these separated biological forms that give rise to pain and suffering. Now, we're not going to go deeply into this because that's something you can read about. Let's think about the evolutionary story. Why do we want to understand and contextualize suffering and the remediation of suffering in an evolutionary model? Why do this? Well, because it helps us understand that our brain has evolved for various reasons and to do various things. And since Darwin, nearly all psychotherapists have some kind of evolutionary model. Okay? The Freudians, of course, have the id, the repertoire for your aggressive and sexual desires. Jung talks a lot about archetypes, the hero archetype, these inherited tendencies to behave in certain kinds of ways. John Bowlby, who we're going to be talking a lot about a little later, talks a lot about the innate mechanisms of attachment within the mammalian line. So all of these theories have an evolutionary focus, but so does cognitive behavior therapy. For example, Tim Beck talks a lot about the defenses of fight, flight, and demobilization. These were the three that he focused on in his book on anxiety, and talks a lot about that these mechanisms could be stimulated through cognitive processes, but also, if they're directly stimulated, they give rise to cognitive processes. And later on, he talked about danger modes. There's a wonderful book by Isaac Marks called Fears and Phobias, which again looks at the evolutionary origins and mechanisms for the arousal of fears and phobias. For example, in panic, what you see is people who have this experience of panic being feeling as if they're going to run amok and run here and run there. But actually, if you look at the way in which many animals escape predators, it's exactly what they do. They engage in zigzag. Okay, they run in zigzag ways. So it's unpredictable patterns of motor activity going on there. Depression is related to mechanisms for coping with defeats and loss, and that's something that I've been involved with for many years. And personality disorders, Tim talked about in terms of being under and over developed innate strategies. So the point about it is that although I'm going to give you an evolutionary model, I don't want you to think that it's unique to CFT. It isn't really. Evolutionary models are implicit in many, many therapies, but they have a slightly different way of thinking about the evolved mechanism and evolved brain. So let's now begin with a reality check, because compassion begins with this understanding, what are we up against in this life that we find ourselves in? And the first thing is that we are an emergent species in the flow of life. So your brain was not developed or built by you. Your brain was built by your genes, and your genes are the products of many, 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 many millions of years of reproduction of your ancestors, and before them, the ancestors of their ancestors, all the way back to the reptiles and even the fishes. So that's what's built your brain, and in your brain you have mechanisms for anger and anxiety and lust and hate and all that. You didn't build any of that capacity, that's all in there built for you. That's very important, because when we come to think about what's going on in our minds, part of what we do when we become mindful is to become mindful of the way our brains are made. But we didn't make them. The second reality is the fact that all of us are on the same journey of life. We've got about 25,000 to 30,000 days if we're lucky, and then we grow for a while, decay and end, and we're all subject to malfunctions, to diseases. We can all get injured quite easily. Our bodies are very easy to injure, and we're in part of a genetic lottery. So any one of you in this room at any moment could get a call from your doctor to say, I'm afraid, you know that blood test we did? Now this is very important, because when we think about compassion, it's about opening our eyes to the nature of what we are all in together. So whereas you have in the Buddhist position, just like me, you want to be happy, just like me, you want to avoid suffering. In the compassion thing, it's just like you, I may find myself here. Just like you, I may find myself. Just like you who have discovered you have cancer, this may be me, or this may be my wife. Okay? So when you get into this kind of way of thinking, it makes you recognize that we are all in this together. No one escapes this. And it's just the dice as to how it goes for each of us. So I might die easily, or I may not. For example, I watched my mother die of vascular dementia, and it was just awful. Okay? And this may well be my fate if it's genetic. So this is really important, because, as you probably know from the story of the Buddha, the Buddha came out from his golden bubble. The story of the Buddha is that his father didn't want him to, there was a prediction that he would become a famous leader but would die poor, and so his father decided he would protect the Buddha, Siddhartha, by having him live in this golden temple, and could have as many women and much wine and song as he wanted, and everything would always be beautiful for him. And of course, one day the Buddha snuck out of the temple, got a bit interested in what was over the gate, and of course had trauma when he discovered death and suffering and disease. Okay, and then decided that he couldn't continue in this golden bubble anymore while this was all going on outside, and that this would be his fate too eventually. And so he decided he would seek the answers to the problems of suffering. And of course, this is the story of the West. The story of the West is we live in golden bubbles. We keep creating golden bubbles and turning our eyes around to what's going on just a few thousand miles down the road. We all do it. We lavish wonderful things on our children while the children of others are starving slowly and dying slowly. It's the way it is. So what compassion does then, is to help us understand this is the reality. Now the the third reality is a very important reality for our therapists, that when we train our therapists, this is a crucial reality. And that is the social circumstances of our lives over which we have no control has really shaped us. So the example that we give here is, we say to our patients, look, I want you to imagine that I was adopted as a 3-day-old baby into a violent drug gang. See, the head of the violent drug gang couldn't have children himself, so he sent his henchmen to snatch a baby out of hospital, and it happened to be me. Okay. What would I be like today? And you get them to tell you, because it's difficult if you do it the other way around, because it's too threatening for them, but getting them to actually start to think about this. So they could actually say, well, maybe you would be a bit violent. No, the chances are I'd be very violent. Okay? Maybe you would have raped people. It's quite possible that. Maybe you'd be in prison. Absolutely, it's possible that. Maybe I'd be dead. Maybe I would have tortured people. Now, of course, these are horrible, horrible, horrible things for us to have to think about. That there are versions within us that could be like that. But if you take this journey, or what Jung would say, the journey into the shadow, it allows you to start to have empathic connections to your patients. Because had I been adopted as a 3-day-old baby, that could be me. Because we know that 80% of guys that grew up in these violent drug gangs here in south of the border, this is what they become. And they get covered in tattoos, and I hate tattoos. So this version of poor Gilbert would not exist. Not only that, we know that the social environment actually shapes and influences the maturation of your brain and genetic expression. So even the genes that are being expressed in me now would be different had I grown up in that environment. And that's the case for all of us. You are only one version of yourself. You have very little idea about what version you might have been in a very different environment. You might have been a Nobel Prize winner, or you might be a criminal. So the point about it is recognizing that this sense of self that we have is extremely fragile. And this is important because what it means is that all of us just find ourselves here with this brain, with these emotions, with a socially shaped sense of self that we didn't choose. We didn't choose any of it. We live it, but we didn't choose it. So life involves dealing with tragedies, and basically everybody in your office is trying to cope with a crazy brain, as I will explain in a moment, as best they possibly can. Everybody is doing their best. Okay? Nobody asked to be here with this brain. Nobody asked to be shaped in the way they were. They're doing their best. And our job really is to help them begin to understand that there are different versions. Okay? There are different versions. And the trick to finding the version is to wake up. Or as the Buddha would say, become enlightened. Because here is the cruelty of it all. Well, it's not cruelty, but here is the fact. It may not be your fault that you have genes for putting on weight if you eat certain foods and you get fat. That may not be your fault. It may not be your fault that you have a problem with your hypothalamus, so you always feel hungry. But if you continue to eat and get obese, you will develop, or you run the risk of developing diabetes. And if you don't do anything about that, you can die pretty horribly. You may lose your sight, you may lose your legs. That's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. If you have the genes for lung cancer, then if you smoke, you are risking dying of lung cancer quite early. It's not your fault. You never asked to have the genes for lung cancer, of course you didn't. But if you don't do anything about it, unfortunately, you may not like the consequences. So a lot of what's important in compassion-focused therapy uses kind of motivational interviewing techniques, and I know that many of you here are very familiar with those, to try to help people recognize it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. It's not your fault, but only you are going to be able to take the actions that you need in order to produce the changes that are going to be conducive to your well-being. So you move from blaming and shaming all the time, away from blaming and shaming, because it doesn't really matter what you did yesterday, it's what you do tomorrow, to making decisions about what would you like to become, what was the self you would like to become. And how would that be for you if you could become that self, right? This is why, as we will do this afternoon, we of course move towards the compassionate self becomes the inner part that wants to be the self that we're going to try and build. So much of what we do in therapy then is that understanding that much of what goes on in our minds is not our design, but it is our responsibility, and we're all in the same boat. So the therapist really begins the process of therapy by what we have in common. That what you have in common with the person sitting opposite you is this person who is also on this journey of life, who also didn't choose to have this brain, who also didn't choose that background that may have abused them or hurt them, who didn't choose any of that, who also is heading for decay and death, who also will have immense pain in their lives that they wouldn't choose, and may well be doing things that are making the matter worse, but they believe they're doing their best. So this is a depathologizing and delabeling. It's understanding people's unique coping processes. Okay, so we're not too keen on things like DSM and so on. They're okay, they have their uses. But for therapists, we start with a deep respectfulness about the journey that people are on. So the causes of suffering then are related to the evolution of the brain, and we're going to be looking at evolutionary function analysis and genotypes and phenotypes. So very quickly then, just to remind you that part of the problem with our brains is that they are evolved, and that evolution has introduced a lot of problems. We have what we call in the business a tricky brain. Now, it's interesting because humans, well, came from the line of primates, and of course one of the things that humans did a few million years ago is to stand up. Okay, so they've got hands free and eyes free. Now that gives you fantastic advantages, okay? But for the female pelvis move forward and change shape so that the human female has the most painful and the most dangerous births of all primates. Why? It's terrible design. It's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. You know giraffes, right? Have you ever seen giraffes? There's long necks, okay? Now, the advantage of having a long neck is because they can eat foods that other animals can't eat. So that's a fantastic advantage. But getting down to drink is none too easy. They're very vulnerable to falling over, breaking their legs. And sex, well, that's very tricky. So there are certain so there are certain aspects of evolved design which are a problem. Okay, now just to go through very quickly, I mean, about 500 million years ago, we had reptilian psychology was in the world, and this is territorial and fear. And then about 120 million years ago, the mammals evolved, and the mammals bring with them a new brain and a new set of psychologies, capacities for caring, group forming, living in groups, and so on. And then we have the human, about 2 million years ago, that has this capacity for thinking and so on. And we also see about 1 million years ago something we call extended caring. Now, extended caring shows up because in the fossil record we find skeletons and so on that shows that humans have survived with very damaged bodies, broken bones, evidence of scarred tissue, disease and so forth. They could only have survived if they were being extensively looked after. So extended caring is very interesting in the archaeological record. Whereas for many animals, I'm afraid if you go down, then I'm afraid that's it. There is obviously caring for the young, but not caring for the old or the sick. Okay, so very quickly, what this means is that you have an old brain that has a whole range of emotions, a whole range of basic behaviors, and a whole range of relationship-seeking mechanisms or motivations, as we'll look at in a moment. Okay, so like your pet then, you too have an interest in sex, you have an interest in status, you form attachments to your friends and your group and your parents, and like many, many animals, unfortunately and tragically, humans are very tribal, okay? It's very easy, as you know from the social psychology, I was talking to Dan here, from social psychology, a lot of social psychology is showing that it's so easy to get people to think in groups and then to dislike the other group. And Dan's doing some really great stuff on that. You also have this new brain there that's capable of thinking and imagining. And one of the things this brain does, and we now think this is to do with a genetic change that produces changes in the way in which synapses and axons and dendrites grow, that you can collate and integrate vast amounts of information. So imagine driving. So Joachim, bless him, drove us around yesterday, and we went down the coast and everything. So there we are, driving, changing gears, going slow, going fast, looking at the car in front of you, the car's coming towards you, watching out for the police because we're driving very quick. Just a joke. Talking to me, and then changing subjects and talking to my wife. Fantastic, right? This is amazing. This is amazing stuff. Chimpanzee could not do anything like that. You do not teach chimpanzees to drive. Oh, and answering the mobile and looking at the sat-nav as well. It's incredible. So integration is very, very important, and it's an absolutely fundamental factor in what we're going to be talking about, because integration can break down with certain kinds of conditions, particularly high stressful load, right? And a friend of mine, sadly, phoned me up a few months ago. She said, I discovered what you said about this, Paul. She said, the other day, I was driving and I drove straight into the back of a lorry. Now, this is a big lorry, but I still didn't see it. And the reason was because I was thinking about going to visit my cousin who has been diagnosed with cancer. I was so preoccupied, I simply didn't see it. And the ability to integrate information from different modalities, such as from emotions or cognitions or behavior, actually for some patients this becomes very difficult. And of course with people with psychosis, those integrative functions start to break down because you can't identify where the thoughts are coming from. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. We also have a social brain. We are the most social species of all, and not only our brains, but also our genetic expressions are very influenced by our social relationships, particularly early in life. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this. So there we are, you have an old brain, we call it old brain, and this old brain has a lot of emotions and motives that we share with many other animals. So just like you respond to affection. Sorry, just like your pet, you respond to affection. A bit of cuddling does you a lot of good, I'm sure. You have an interest in status and belonging to groups and friendships and all of that. But you also have this new brain, which is a wonderful brain, really, because it's what makes it possible for me to be here with you today, with all this wonderful technology. We are a scientific animal. I mean, that's very clear. But as in all things with evolution, it comes with a cost. And the cost is the fact that it creates loops. So imagine, for example, a zebra running away from a lion. And the zebra runs, and eventually the lion gives up and wants off. Very quickly, the zebra will give up, will go back to eating and grazing. In other words, they will calm down from quite a major threat very, very quickly. Okay? But the human doesn't do that. The human starts ruminating. Oh my God, can you imagine what would have happened if I got caught? Can you imagine being choked? Oh my God, that was terrible. Can you imagine being eaten alive? Oh. So you play it again and again and again and again and again and again. And they put all kinds of things. And suppose there'd be 2 lions. And they wake up in the middle of the night. Oh my God, what about tomorrow? And the children. I'd never thought about the children. What about the children if there's... Okay, so it's wonderful brain, but it's also the brain of rumination and looping. And when we loop, we also create a lot of fantasies and imaginations. And those things then stir up the emotions. Now, you can use your imagination on purpose, actually, and we'll be doing this a little later today. So if you lay in bed and you deliberately imagine something very sexual, you're going to stir up stuff in your body. Your imagination actually is a probe, and it can go into a very precise area of your brain and stimulate that area. And this, if it's a sexual one, then it'll be your pituitary to release hormones. So we have capacities for actually turning on and off systems in our brain. And as I say, the example of sexual fantasy is the most obvious and easy way of understanding this. But the key thing then is recognizing that if your imagination gets caught up in things that are frightening to you, then just like in the case of sexual fantasy, then a frightening image is going to start stimulating this. And so your body will be responding to these images that are being created in these loop-back systems. And part of what cognitive therapy does is to try to help people identify these loops, these cognitive systems, so that you can break out of them and give your brain a rest. So there we are, you see. Eat, survive. What's this all about? But the brain also has a number of built-in biases, so we'll tend to be self-focused or kin-focused. So if you have a baby, for example, and you go to the hospital and they take the baby off to weigh it, and then they come back and they say to you, I'm terribly sorry, we've lost your baby. But listen, I've got good news. Don't worry, we've had some wonderful babies born here today. Just come into the pen and you can choose your baby, just see the one you fancy. So no, we want to look after our own genes rather than others, and we have a lot of in-group preferences. It's very easy for us to have. So not only do you have these looping in your brain, but your brain's also biased in certain kinds of ways. But of course, what's interesting, and all of you will be familiar with this, is you also have a capacity for attending to attention. You can become aware of being aware. So mindfulness is the ability to hold your attention as an observer of this. So you learn how to observe this process rather than your attention being in it. So if your attention is in it, so if you're laying in bed fantasizing something sexual, then you're in it. If you're laying in bed observing your mind, creating fantasies, then it's up here. And I have to tell you, if you do this, it doesn't quite work. You don't get aroused. I'm just watching, oh, look what I'm doing now. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, it's gone. Oh. Okay, now... So mindfulness naturally calms this down. And there's a whole lot of things, but we'll talk about that later on today. Now, there's the Theravadins are very keen on arguing that compassion comes out of mindfulness, and you just be mindful, pay attention to the body, pay attention, which is fine. But compassion-focused therapy says, well, that's okay, but actually compassion is a motivating system, and it's a motivational system that is rooted in the caring system, particularly the attachment, but not only, as we will see, the attachment system. And therefore, what we're interested in is working down in these deeper areas of the brain. And in fact, there's quite a lot of research now showing that mindfulness tends to involve the upper levels of the brain, particularly the midline and frontal cortex, whereas compassion and caring behavior is down the perinatal gray area, down in the midbrain area. Won't go too much into that, but what we want to do is by stimulating this as a motive, then you stimulate what people feel, you stimulate what they imagine, what they think, what they plan, what they want to do, what their thoughts are. So this becomes the orientation and the organization of your mind. Whereas if you stimulate people into a competitive goal or motivational system, then the competitive goal will stimulate a very different organization of mind. So the key thing is that we have a very tricky brain. That's the first thing. Watch out for that. Mindfulness will help us, but so will understanding our basic motivational systems. And at the moment, I think a lot of people recognize that we are caught up in this one, and we are all paying the price in terms of what's happening to our world. It's the ecology and so on and so on. So I want to introduce this concept of a social mentality as another kind of key thing within compassion-focused therapy. So as I say, I do apologize because this first part of the morning is pretty heavy. We go rat-a-tat-tat a bit. We go through these things quickly, but I will summarize them for you. Now, social mentality is the fact that a social motivational system is dependent on and responds to a motivational system in somebody else, in another being. So if you take compassion, for example, then compassion has to be understood as an integration, as an interaction. So there's a person who is caring and doing the helping, being the provider, that is dependent upon specific abilities such as your attention, you pay attention to suffering and so on, capacity for empathy. And we also know there are facilitators and inhibitors. So we know, for example, it's much easier for you to care and love and help your own children than somebody else's, to care and help somebody you like than somebody you don't like, than somebody who seems similar to you than somebody who seems very different to you. So there are facilitators and inhibitors of this motivating system. But of course, there also has to be, and this is where it becomes very important in terms of the therapy, individuals who respond to being cared for, who are open to caring. Okay, and can be changed as a result of receiving care. Okay, and we know that there are facilitators and inhibitors here too. And one of the things that's important then in compassion-focused therapy is that people have to be good at this, but they also have to be good at that. And that's where a lot of our patients struggle. So many of our patients say, oh yes, I can be caring and helpful to other people, but I'm not very good at being responsive to the care of others. I kind of think, well, you know, maybe you're doing that to be liked, or maybe you're doing that because you want something out of me. So they're not responsive to being cared for. They don't trust easily, put it like that. And also they're not very self-compassionate either. So what I want to do now is to try to show you, so there are a number of motivations, we won't go into those, to show you this whole concept of what we mean by social mentality. Social mentality means that we have to understand the mind as primarily a social signal processing system, right? So although we've got a new brain, this new brain's only 2 million years old. The real deal for your brain, the real change agent, is in the social interactional process. Now I'm hoping this is going to work. So I'm going to show you this example from Eric Tronick.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay, so all of this is on YouTube, okay? It's just put in still face. It's wonderful research by Electronic over many years. It's quite old now, but it's basic psychological science, right? Basic psychological science is telling us that your brain is primarily responsive, particularly at an emotional level, to social signals, right? And therefore, when we come to do the practices this afternoon, keep that in mind, because that's what we're trying to do. Now, here's another aspect which I think is really important, which is related to what we call encouragement. And again, this is where's my thing gone to? Here it is.
In the experiment, babies between
This is all on the website. You can see it easily. Wonderful piece of research by Joseph Campos.
Is a checkerboard pattern just underneath the surface, which the baby thinks is plenty safe to crawl. But halfway across is a visual cliff, which the baby can tell drops off steeply. The plexiglass top continues, so we know it's perfectly fine to proceed. But the baby isn't so sure. And this is a big drop for a baby just starting to crawl. She wants to get across to get the top, but she's learned to be cautious from dealing with stairs and such. This is where the adult comes in.
In this particular investigation, what we attempted to understand is the extent to which the nonverbal facial communication coming from the mother to the child powerfully affected that baby's behavior. If the mother is posing a fear face, the baby typically does not cross this modified visual clip, visual step. On the other hand, if the mother poses a smile or somehow poses a nonverbal communication that is not prohibitive but encouraging, the child is much more likely to cross over to her. This particular study demonstrates the role of nonverbal communication in determining the child's behavior in uncertain contexts.
Okay, so I think those two things really, I think, are quite lovely little videos. Really, the power of social engagement, facial expressions, voice tones, and so on, in terms of affect regulation. And you saw the distress when it was broken, and the joy when it came back, right? And then the second one was really about the way in which, certainly as children, our encouragement comes from each other, comes from others. And this is important because we know in terms of children who are anxious, the modeling is very, very important in terms of how the parent models anxiety and coping with novelty and so on. But it's also the case with us as well. I mean, when we are doing things that are a bit scary, it's nice to have people that encourage us. And I had a video, which I can't find now, of somebody who was in a group going to do a bungee jump. And she didn't want to do it. And so but the rest of the group were very encouraging, in a very nice way. And anyway, she did it. And of course, you're absolutely delighted to have done it, right? So the point is that the process of encouragement, how we give courage, how do you give courage to people to face things that they don't want to face? This is really not being so well investigated in psychotherapy research. And that's why I think some therapists are better than others, because they seem to have this ability to facilitate a process of people doing things and having to go. You've got to be slightly careful. I'll tell you a story, which is a bit... It's the first day... I'd only just qualified as a psychologist, as a clinical psychologist, and I was doing my first agoraphobic on my own, without supervision. And so we worked quite hard with this lady who'd been agoraphobic for 20 years, and she was going to walk around a market area, which was about 10-15 minute walk for the first time on her own, and I was going to stand by the church, and she walked around the... It's like standing here, and then she'd go around the thing. Anyway, so off she went. It was an exciting day. She was a bit anxious and so on. So 10 minutes went past, and that's fine, right? 15 minutes went past, fine. 20 minutes went past. Half an hour. Oh, my God. Where's this place? I can't do it. Anyway, 40 minutes later, she turns up with all these shopping bags. So, she said, I've never been able to do this for so many years. It was so nice knowing you were there. So I was having this panic attack, thinking, oh my God, my patient's died. Okay, so that's important. Now, in terms of compassion, right, we are going to be doing quite a lot about the attachment system and the importance of caring, but I want you to watch this. This is really nice. And again, this is on the website. All you need to do is to put in experiments with altruism in children and chimps. Watch this. This is Wanikin and Tomasello. Now, Tomasello has done some wonderful work on altruism in children. He's got a book out and a lot of excellent papers. But anyway, so just to show that's their work. One thing, what I'd like just to notice, right, this is important, is the pleasure, okay, the joyfulness of being able to do it together and to help, right? Now, the point about compassion then is remembering that compassion is a process, and it's not just the compassion we feel this way, but we give that way. And one of the things that I was very keen on when I did Depression in the 80s book was to argue that many people who are depressed don't feel of any value to someone else. They feel they don't matter, okay? At those days I was seeing people in nursing homes, elderly people, and one of the reasons for their depression was the fact that nobody was interested in their knowledge. They didn't have anything to offer anybody. They couldn't make a difference to anybody's lives anymore. They were just, as one person said, I'm just a lump here who sits and shits. That's all I do. I just sit and shit. What use am I? I'm not used to anybody. The sooner I die, the better. So this is really important, the joyfulness in humans of actually being able to make contributions. And in fact, why are you here today? Why are you learning all this stuff called clinical psychology? Because you have a desire to be helpful. Okay, and this desire to be helpful is fundamental. Okay, and it begins at a very early age. So share a little bit more. Okay, I'll share some more. Okay, that's more complicated. But the point about it is that chimpanzees have the same kind, well, not the same, I shouldn't say that, it's not wrong. That's wrong. But they also have an understanding that another person or needs help in completing a goal and a task. So although we're going to be talking about caring very much from the attachment system, we need to understand that humans are fundamentally have a desire to be helpful to others, and we see this from a very, very early age. Okay, so let's come back here. Now, I'm not going to take very many more minutes of your time because you will need a little break. But what I want to do now is to, having set this up and talked a little bit about the evolutionary model, the fact you've got a tricky brain, right? And that we are basically a species that are highly responsive to social signals, and that has implications for therapy. I want to now just talk a little bit about emotions and the famous three-circle model. Okay, so you'll all know this, that motives and emotions are quite different, okay? And we have Eve Ekman here, and of course Paul Ekman's very famous for making these distinctions very clear, does some fabulous work over many, many years, and talks a lot about the issue of motivation and emotion in relationship to compassion. Compassion is motivation. It's not so much an emotion, and the emotions that can arise in compassion are various. But, so motives are things that guide you. So right now you could want to be the best psychologist in the whole world, right? That's fine. And that will stay with you perhaps for the whole of your life, okay? Your emotions will come and go according to how that motive is doing. So if you feel you're doing very badly, then the likelihood is you won't feel so good. But if you think you're doing great, and everybody comes to see you gets better, then you're probably going to feel better. So emotions really are sort of like the guidance of your motives. But it turns out that we have 3 different types of emotion system. In fact, there are more than 3, so I'm lying to you really. But these 3 are really quite important. And this is called functional analysis, evolutionary function analysis. Now, what evolutionary function analysis means is simply that we understand a system in terms of what it was evolved to do. Okay, so if you think about many things in the body, you can only understand those things by understanding their functions. Like the heart. If you didn't understand that the heart was there to pump, and of course many of the Greeks didn't quite understand this, that the heart was there to pump blood around the body, and then you could think that was where you did all your thinking, right? And there was a view at one time that the heart was the place of the soul where all the thinking happened. But of course now we understand the functions of the system, we understand it in a much better way. So this is the famous 3-circle system, and what it means is that there are functions, that you have emotions that alert you to threat and will guide you towards self-protection. You have emotions that alert you to rewards and opportunities and reinforces and resources and will guide you and motivate you and energize you to those things. But you also have a system which is there to help you rest. It's called rest and digest. In other words, if you're always seeking or you're always dealing with threats all the time, your body will get burnt out very quickly. So the body needs to rest and to be at a place of peace. And you can only do that if you feel safe. So the famous 3 circles are these. That this is basically your threat system, and your threat system is the system which is the dominant system in your brain. Okay, Baumeister and Twang wrote a very good paper called Bad is Stronger Than Good in the Review of General Psychology. It's an APA journal about 2001. And the reason for this is that your threat system is designed to overrule everything else. So if you're in the jungle and you're eating a nice lunch and you're chatting up a nice partner maybe, you're thinking this is going very well and you're enjoying your bananas or whatever. All of that has to be switched off pretty quickly if you hear the roar of a lion or you see a lion moving your way. So all of these desires and things have to be switched off. If you're just laying there peacefully enjoying the warmth of the sun, again, this will turn that off very quickly. So your threat system is designed to turn off your positive emotion systems, and we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. Now, I should just maybe say this. This system is an activating system, so if you take amphetamine or something like that, you'll become activated and excited and so on and so on, whereas this is a calming positive affect system. So this is excitement, positive affect. This is actually soothed, calming, an affect of at peace. I'm at peace. Okay, so let's have a think how this works, and this is how we explain it to our patients. Okay, take anxiety. So what happens in your body when you get anxious? Okay, now this is quite a big group and we're a little bit short for time, but if we had more time, and what we do with the group is we get the group to tell us what happens when you get anxious. And then some of them will say, oh, well, I feel tense, my heart rate goes up. Another person might say dry mouth. And so we write these all up on a flip chart. Okay, so the patient recognizes that this anxiety system is designed to do that. Okay, that's what it's designed to do. When it does that to your body, there's nothing wrong with your body. That's what it's designed to do. And what happens to your attention, right? Because remember, in compassion-focused and mindfulness-based therapy, attention becomes the issue, really. Well, it becomes narrowed, okay? So it always narrows down on the things that you are being attentive to. And it's designed to start scanning and looking for threats, right? So that's what it's supposed to do. So it's automatically going to start moving you towards catastrophizing, not because you're crazy or irrational. Well, it is irrational, but because it's not your fault, because that's what an anxiety system is designed to do, right? So if you become anxious about things, your mind will start thinking about other things that could go wrong. Okay, and that's just the way it is. And of course, there are various behaviors which are associated with anxiety, the things that your body will want to do. These are the body systems. And if we think of anger, actually it turns out that you have quite similar and overlapping bodily experiences. And again, in our group, we spend quite a lot of time talking about this because particularly with the patients I work with who have what we call borderline personality disorders, they're not very good at distinguishing the different signs and symptoms in their body. So you say to them, you feel tense. In what way is the tension of anger different from the tension of anxiety? They won't know. And they don't really know in their bodies if they're feeling anxious or they're feeling tense. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, is the fact that the tension of anxiety is different. For example, if you become very anxious, then you may urinate or defecate. You'll never do that if you get raged in rage. You never do that. You never lose control over those muscles, but you can if you get very frightened. So these are important things that we help patients begin to recognize. But both of them are sympathetic arousal, you see. And so unless patients are kind of clued into bodily experiences, they can miss it. And of course, also, you have a narrowing of attention quite naturally, okay? So, for example, supposing you go Christmas shopping, and in 9 shops the people are really kind to you. How can I help you, sir? Or madam, what would you like? Oh, yes, we've got just the thing for you, and I'm glad to tell you, actually it's on offer. I can give you a 10% discount. I'm delighted with it. So you come out of the shop and you think, great, it's wonderful. Then you go into one shop, and the assistant is talking to somebody else about a party they just went to, and they're chatting about whatever, their makeup or the girl they've just got. I said, just hang on a minute, please, sir. Wait a moment, sir. I just have to finish my conversation, okay? Just talking to my friend here. Just wait. So they treat you a bit like that, and then they shortchange you. Who do you think about when you go home? Okay? Who do you ruminate about? What goes round and round in your mind? Should you write to the store manager and complain? Where do they get these people from? It's disgraceful they employ people like that. And the 90% of the good feelings that you had on your Christmas shopping is out of the window. You don't bring to mind all of the lovely people that helped you. Okay, now in compassion training, one of the things you do, of course, is you train people to do exactly that. Notice that your mind has been taken over by your threat system, and it's okay, it's not your fault, you can let it happen if you want. But if you do, this will be having an influence on your body, because your thoughts and your imagination play in your body like fingers on a piano. Now you know that because you've already told them and they've already seen it with the brain and the loops. So you can let your anger rumination play in your body if you want to. There's no law against it. But think of the consequences of doing that. And think what would happen if you said, I think what I'll actually do is to, on purpose, slow down and make myself remember all of the good people. Find the good. Look for the good. Okay. So the next thing that I want to do is, and this will be the last thing before we go to coffee break, is to argue, put the point of view that compassion-focused therapy is very interested in conflict. So all of those of you who are interested in the psychodynamic approaches, you'll like this bit. Now I have to tell you, however, that my understanding of the conflict emotions came from a behaviorist, a guy called Forster, who was writing in the 70s about conflict of emotions. And then when I was training, I had did some training in Sussex University, and they, in the 70s, were very keen on classical conditioning. Everything was classical conditioning, right? Now, you all know what classical conditioning is, so I won't go into that. But basically, first, his key point was the fact that if a child has a lot of anger, and the parent punishes the child for anger, then the punishment produces anxiety, okay? Or fear, or shock, or distress. And Forster's point was, if this happens on a regular occasion, then what will happen is that these cues, these internal cues, would become associated with this. Now this is body memory, and classical conditioning and body memory is really, really important. Just to give you another example of classical conditioning, one-trial learning and body memory, and how powerful it is, and it's a non-cognitive system, right? Imagine that you go to a party, Yotam has a party, and you all pile into his house, and it's great, and he's dancing away, he's playing the bongos, everything's great. And then, do you play the bongos? And somebody gives you a beer, and you smell this beer, you think, oh, that's fine, because you're a bit drunk by now. And so you drink it, and then very shortly afterwards, you're quite poorly, okay? You're very ill, you're vomiting and all the rest, which we won't go into. And but you're okay after a couple of days, you get better. Whew, that was awful. So you've been poisoned by the beer. It was a bad pint. And then a few weeks later, you hear of another party at Yotam's, and you think, okay, I'll go along. And as you go through the door, somebody hands you a pint of beer and you smell it. What happens in your body? Exactly. That, my friend, they get, right. So that's the nose, right? So this is a sensory cue that goes straight up into your hypothalamus or wherever it is, into the smell, and that recreates the feelings of nausea. It doesn't make you anxious, doesn't make you angry. It recreates the body of nausea, which is what you experienced a couple of weeks ago. You were in a state of nausea. So sensory cues then have very powerful access to bodily processes and bodily feelings and bodily memories. And after the break, we're going to be looking quite a lot at bodily memories. So this is important. And sometimes, of course, people can't have any cognitions. They don't have any cognitions associated with body memory. And this is particularly true for children who have been abused at a young age. So this is rather horrible to talk to you about, but children who have been ejaculated on or have been made to have oral sex or whatever it is, they can have horrible feelings of disgust. That gets coded into the body. And sometimes those cues can be triggered without them really understanding the cue, and they can just be filled with feelings of disgust and horror. And it's like a flashback, but they won't always be able to identify. And if you say to them, well, you must have had a thought, you must have had a cognition, that's just unkind, because the answer is no. Just like you have the pint of beer, you don't walk into the room and think, oh, it's a pint of beer. Now let me remember, last time I had a pint of beer, I was sick. Yes, I was. Oh my God, I feel sick. It's a non-cognitive route. And of course, classical theorists are very keen on understanding non-cognitive routes. Now, supposing that you have an individual who is seeking care, and every time they seek care, they get abused or they're punished, and of course, this feelings within themselves are going to create anxiety, and so every time they start to move towards or be open to care, they're going to become very anxious. And these are classical conditioning models. Imagine that you like going on holiday, and you look forward to your holidays, and the thoughts of holidays and swimming pools and drinking the margaritas is always lovely for you, but then one year you go and you get severely beaten up and robbed. It's going to be a while before you'll be able to remember holidays again without feeling bad. Okay, so classical conditioning, very, very important. It's the way in which organisms learn and the way in which our bodies are changed directly by emotions and sometimes by memories as well. Okay, now the thing that I want to talk to you a little bit about before the break is this whole issue, and we might be able to do something on this after the break depending on time. But this is something that the short-term psychodynamic therapists are very keen on, but as I say, I learned this from the behaviorists really. And this is that one emotion can block another. So anger can block anxiety and sadness, and this is the one that we have in borderline personality. There's quite a lot of research coming now that borderlines are not very good with sadness. They don't do grief very well, and they'll always go here, but they can't go here. Some individuals, particularly depressed people, can sit here and sometimes here, but they can't do this. This is the example of somebody who has an argument with their husband. The husband perhaps is rather unkind to them, I don't know why I married you, you're not a very good cook. And so the patient says, oh, it's true, I try so hard, but I'm just no good. And you say to the patient, were you angry at all about the way your husband said it? No, he was telling the truth. Are you sure? No, I couldn't possibly feel angry to him. And it turns out that actually, of course, that this patient is depressed because she's incredibly angry with this guy. But she's very frightened of it. And she's never really been able to talk about feelings of anger or work through feelings of anger, because anger is always associated with being a bad person, an unlovable person, or being hit or being made to feel bad. So whenever she begins to feel that, she can't feel that, she can only feel that. So understanding these blockages are really important, and there are various ways in which we can do that, which we'll have a go after the break. And also, we can find that different types of strategies, this is a more complicated point, but some individuals always take the dominant strategy. For example, people with narcissistic disorders will always go for dominant strategies, always, always, always. They will not play a subordinate strategy. Whereas people who are dependent will always play the subordinate strategy, they will never play the dominant strategy. Okay, so I think at this point then, and we will come back to the conflicts of emotions and how you work with conflict emotions a little later on, but the most important thing is that the threat system is your most dominant system. It's a tricky system. The emotions that are fired off can often be fired off together, and then they conflict with each other. And we'll have a think about that after the break. Now, Tim, you mentioned how long there was for the break.
15 minutes.
It's a 15-minute break, so it's not a huge amount of time, just enough to get a bit of a suntan and then come back.